In No Time to Die, there is a scene where James Bond and Moneypenny arrive unannounced at the home of Q. He's clearly preparing for a romantic dinner. The table is nicely set, he's gussying up his hair, he's wanting to shoo off his pair of colleagues, and, of course, he says...
He'll be here in 20 minutes.
So, I think it's clear that that single pronoun denotes that Q is queer and can join the pantheon of fellow LGBTQ characters present throughout the 007 cinematic history. As a gay Bond fan who has many times felt like he has more in common with Ben Whishaw's Q than James Bond himself, I did kind of resonate with this, and I thought it was a cute little detail in line with the glimpses into the private lives of the MI6 staff that we get in the previous Craig films. And I know that it's something that resonated with a lot of other queer Bond fans too, and there have been several articles discussing this feature, including one in The Guardian where Ben Whishaw talks about the scene, and, well, I was kind of surprised by some of the stuff in this article regarding Wishaw's own feelings about how that scene was handled in the film, and we'll get on to talking about that in due course, but the line that really stood out to the pedant Bond fan in me in that particular article was the one claiming that the series had never once admitted the existence of an LGBTQ community in the 24 Bond films that preceded No Time to Die. Well, my friends Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd would like to have a word with you about that, sir. It surprised me to such an extent that I'm really genuinely stunned that this misperception even exists. Like, there are characters in this film series who are clearly queer, like, not even just hinted at, like, it's kind of open, and a good few of these are from the first decade of the series' film history, so given that, I felt like it was a good time to shine a spotlight on some of these queer Bond characters and have a conversation about them and what each of them brings to their parts in their respective films. And joining me in this conversation is David Lowbridge-Ellis of License to Queer. Hello, David, and could you tell us a little bit about your site?
Yeah, so thank you, Calvin. I know we've been talking for quite some time, actually, so this is lovely. The first time we've actually managed to have a proper face-to-face. And in fact, you were name-dropped in one of the first ever pieces that I put on License to Queer, which was exploring the video game GoldenEye from the point of view of a queer player, and I reached out to you, and you sent me your thoughts about that as well, which we'll probably get into during the rest of this. But long story short, I was sort of fed up of LGBTQ plus voices being left out of the conversation about Bond, and also a lot of misconceptions, which is why we're here today to unpick one of those misconceptions. So yeah, the website's been up and running for nearly 2 years now, and there's a lot of content on there, not just by me but by other queer Bond fans too. And I fairly recently, the last few months, started a podcast version of some of the articles as well. So yeah, it's going well.
No, I've spent many an hour on your site, so it's all really great work, because one of the main reasons why I wanted to cover this particular topic as a conversation is that I feel like some of the characters that we're going to talk about during this video, there are elements that are perhaps open to interpretation, things that are coded, and maybe things that would have perhaps been more obvious in the times that the films were released, and you know, that might not be to an audience now. And I know from reading many an article on your site that you are so well-tuned and so well aware of so many of the historical contexts, so much more than I am, certainly. So when I kind of started thinking about making this video, I thought I need to talk through this with David. So thank you very much for joining.
No, thank you very much for having me, Calvin. I've been a massive fan of yours for a very long time, and I know you've done an awful lot of signposting people to License to Queer as well, who've kind of reached out to you. So no, this is going to be really nice.
Oh, great. Okay, so before we kind of jump back in time to talk about these film characters and a bit of Fleming as well, I just want to touch on the Ben Whishaw Guardian interview to kind of gauge some of your reactions to some of the comments made about No Time to Die in that. Obviously, the reason why we're having this conversation is because it inaccurately claims that Q is the first gay character in the Bond series, and there have been several in the past, but I just want to gauge like how you felt reading some of Ben's comments in that article, because some of them I must admit kind of took me by surprise. So yeah, I'm curious to know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I was the same, and I think the problem is with an article like that is they take a snippet of it and it gets reprinted on lots of other websites, and you actually go back to the original piece, and my take on it anyway is that the interviewer said he had mixed feelings about Q being outed in No Time to Die. And then Ben Whishaw asked him to expand on those, and then he said that it didn't go far enough, it should have been a plot development, blah blah blah. So I think Ben Whishaw was in the situation, and he's quite an introverted person from all accounts, where he kind of wanted to agree with the interviewer in a sense. And if you look at those comments quite closely, he says, I'm very happy to admit maybe some things were not great about that creative decision. I'm a linguist by training, and as soon as I read that statement, it says, I'm happy to admit maybe were not great. It's quite hedging language. So he's sort of not saying definitively, this is how I feel about this. So I think he's trying to converge. That's a linguistic term. I think he's trying to converge the interviewer. Basically, he's trying to make the interviewer feel better and feel good. And I think that quote has been taken out of context. And, ultimately, the bit that doesn't get re-quoted is where Ben Whishaw says, I think it came from a good place. So, where's that as the headline? It's just easier to make a negative story, isn't it?
I completely agree with you, because I think there's another bit in the article where the interviewer is kind of leading the conversation into realms of like it being a studio mandated choice to make Q gay, and he kind of pushes back on that, and he's like, no, it did come from a good place, and that's not my understanding. And indeed, I mean, the studios are normally the ones that are sort of trying to rein that kind of thing in. Like certainly there were comments made about Skyfall recently, where it was kind of up to Barbara Broccoli and the producers to kind of push some of those lines.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, didn't they dig their heels in and said, no, the line about what makes you think this is my first time stays in the movie?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. So let's go way back in time now and talk a bit about mentions of homosexuality through Fleming's works. Because I know that you've written about some of these instances on your site, and I think it's very much important to touch on these briefly before we go through the film characters, because I think it's very much there in the original texts, and I don't think that anyone is going to be holding up any of Fleming's queer characters as great instances of representation in art. But I mean, my perception is that the author was certainly quite fascinated with sexuality. Is that your impression too?
Oh my God, yes. And that's one of the misconceptions that I wanted to address. I deal with both the films and the books and video games on the website. And although I do the queer reviews of the films and look back through the films with queer lenses on, if the film was based off one of the books, I end up folding in a lot of the book stuff as well as we go. But I know not everyone's read the books, so I kind of try to do both at the same time, and for those who haven't read the books, kind of make what I'm trying to say about them make sense. But my count, and I might have missed one, there's a direct reference to homosexuality in 7 of the 12 Bond novels, and some of those aren't characters, but they are direct references, and I find them quite fascinating time capsules of how homosexuality was viewed at those time periods. So for instance, the first one is in Moonraker, so the 3rd novel, and there's a passing reference as Bond sits awkwardly in a police station waiting to meet Valance about he's there for a good reason, he's not there for a bad reason, he's not a parent desperately about to explain to a police officer that their son isn't a homosexual, because of course in the early 50s that's why you might end up in a police station. So there's kind of those passing references, but then there are characters. So Rosa Klebb, for instance, is probably the first queer character, and unlike the film, it's more complex, to be honest, with Rosa Klebb in the novel. So I think I ended up, when I did my piece about From Russia with Love, I think I ended up concluding that Fleming describes her as a neuter, and she's had sex with men and women, but she doesn't get anything from it apart from the sexual fulfillment. So I think we could probably reasonably safely, if we were to put Rosa Klebb in a box, then she would probably be aromantic. So there's lots of different queer identities in there, not just homosexuals, but Fleming is rather, maybe it's kind of over-egging it a bit, but I think he's a bit obsessed with homosexuality in some of his books. And I think part of that is because he actually had quite a few gay friends, really close gay friends. So who knows what they thought of his treatment of homosexuality.
Oh, I would pay good money to hear what Noel Coward had to say about Fleming's neighbour, of course, in Jamaica.
Yeah, there are a few snippets. I think in the Andrew Lycett the biography, I think there are a few snippets in there, but there isn't much. But yeah, I'd love to hear that as well.
Interesting. Okay, well, this is a good segue then, I guess, to talking about some of the film characters, because Rosa Klebb is, unless you're going to usurp me with some Dr. No character that I haven't ever considered, but I think of Rosa Klebb as being,
not really, no,
as being the first queer James Bond character, and I think it's interesting when you look at, some of the articles that were sort of feeding from that initial Guardian interview, and they were kind of talking about the first queer character in the Bond series and stuff. I think if you actually look at like the top 10 highest grossing film franchises of all time, Bond is in there, and it probably has more named notable queer characters than any of the others, I would say, put together. And it starts like right there in the 60s, like in the second film. And I think some of these characters that we're going to talk about, it could be kind of open to interpretation, perhaps. With Rosa Klebb, I think it's not subtext, it's text. Like, she is very much flirting with Tatiana, and this is obviously an adaptation of a sequence from the book where it is a more obvious, I guess, more pronounced. But here, she's very much, I mean, she says, "You're a fine-looking girl," and she's kind of lingering, looks at her, she touches her leg, she's sort of rubbing her hands. It's like, it's very much there, I think.
Oh, 100%. And I think the film perhaps maybe takes it in a different direction, because for me, it's not even coded. I know we'll talk about that in a bit probably, but it's not even coded. It is there in the text. She's a lesbian character. She's not aromantic. She's not neuter, whatever that means, to use Fleming's term. She's a lesbian character. And you could say that with the stereotypical clothing, the hair. Lotte Lenya was in German cinema a few decades before, was like a sex symbol, a sex siren, and they purposely, using the kind of codes of their day, turn her into what people might think a lesbian looks like. I've got a couple of lesbian friends who we watch Bond films with, one of whom has only recently got into Bond and one of whom loved it as a child. We haven't watched From Russia with Lovely yet. I'm dying to know how they're going to take the representation of Rosa Klebb when we get to there.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, you're gonna have to let me know. That'd be really yeah, because I mean, I again, I don't think we're going to be talking about many of these characters as sort of like great representations of queer characters in media, no. But I have always really enjoyed that scene. And I think if you were to take out Rosa Klebb's lesbianism from it, it would be it would be kind of a dull scene without it. I think giving that element to the character just gives that scene a certain edge, and you feel Tatiana's kind of unease at being, flirted with, and I think it works well in that regard.
I think it actually helps the structure of the movie as well, because ultimately the film ends with Bond and Klebb. This is how I see it anyway. This might be my bias coming in here, but I see it as almost like Bond and Klebb battling for Tatiana at the end. It's like they want her. Whereas if you don't have that, I mean, the books, as you know, the book is structured very differently. You have all the setup with Smersh, and then the second half is the plan coming to fruition. Without that thread of Klebb being romantically or sexually interested in Tatiana, I don't think the structure of the movie would work as well as it does, but that might just be me.
No, that's really interesting. Hey, this is why we're having this conversation. That never occurred to me before, but no, I love it. Okay, well, let's move on to the next film in the series, because in the very next film in the series, we have Pussy Galore. And this might be a bit more coded. I'm interested to hear your take on it. It's more subtle, I would say. She kind of has the line saying Bond's flirting with her and she says, "I'm immune." And that's kind of the, what we're supposed to take, that she's not interested in men. In the book, it's much more kind of obvious. Same with another character, Tilly Masterson or Masterton. I can never remember which is the film and which is the book. But that character is infatuated with Pussy Galore in the book. She survives much longer throughout the film than in the film. In the film, I still think there's a bit of coding going on there, or maybe maybe perhaps that's not the correct word, but she's certainly less interested in Bond than most of the other women in the film. She's very sort of, when he's sort of introducing himself to her, she kind of pushes by him. She doesn't seem terribly interested in him at all. I think the only time she smiles is when they're in the Aston Martin together, and she's admiring his gadgets and all that kind of stuff.
So to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's far more subtle in Goldfinger. Obviously, it's far more subtle than the book, which is all kinds of problematic. Yeah, I must admit, I think Goldfinger was the first ever Bond film I saw, and I think I was about 6. I'm just trying to think, did I kind of suspect something there? I don't know. And to be honest, I don't think I probably kind of twigged that that line that you've already said about her being immune was a coded reference to her being a lesbian. And yeah, Tilly, I think it is quite subtle. I think perhaps because she's got a stereotypical kind of hair's pulled back, isn't it? If I remember correctly, when he first meets her. So she's kind of severe and sort of behaves. Most women in Fleming drive like men. He makes a point of pointing that out every time. She drove like a man, and that's exactly it's a threat to his male vanity that she overtakes him. That's how I always read that scene, and then uses the tire slashes. So she's sort of positioned as male, a bit like Pussy Galore is, because she's a pilot, which back then would have been quite stereotypically male profession. Their clothing, I don't think, the expert on this is Dr. Luella Chapman, so I'll have to ask her, because I always have trouble analysing the clothing in detail, but I don't think the clothing is especially masculine for them, which is probably the most common way of coding characters, like with Klebb with her uniform and so forth. Yeah, I think it's more subtle. Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
and obviously, touching on the problematic elements that I think are sort of in the book and the film, kind of, Pussy Galore is certainly converted in both instances through Bond's magical penis, to put it mildly.
How much academic attention has been paid to Bond's magical penis? I've only realised that in the last couple of years while doing these articles. I mean, the quote that always sticks in my mind from Goldfinger, the novel, is that from Bond's point of view, Fleming writes, he felt the sexual challenge all beautiful lesbians have for men. I'm not really, being a gay man, I'm not really qualified to comment there. However, I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking, is that actually, and I'm not giving Fleming a free pass here, but is that actually that dissimilar from gay men fantasizing, emphasis on the word fantasizing, rather than it necessarily being reality, but fantasizing about straight men and kind of converting them? They're immune to me, but I kind of like the challenge. So yeah, as I say, I'm not giving Fleming a free pass, but I think it's probably not as clear cut as a lot of people think it is.
I think there's a line in the book, isn't there, when there's a point in all of the action where Tilly's eventual undoing is that she doesn't stick with Bond and she wants to go and she wants to be with Pussy. And I think she actually has a line that says, I want to be with Pussy, which is like such a, that's not really subtext, that's just text. And then I think she dies like immediately after that. She gets shot or something like that. I can't quite remember.
That's like a Die Another Day level of obviousness, like, I don't like cockfights. Yes, we get the idea. All right. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're moving on to perhaps even more subtle, and I'd appreciate if you don't mind defining kind of what coded means when we talk about Sir Hilary Bray from Majesty's Secret Service, because I think a lot of this is quite coded, as I understand it anyway.
Yeah, so coding, and I know we've mentioned it a couple of times, and it comes into basically everything I write on the website and every podcast, but coding is essentially where you don't explicitly state somebody is gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans or asexual, aromantic, non-binary, etc. You don't explicitly state it, but you drop enough hints to the audience. And you could even argue that No Time to Die is coded, because there is just the only thing that outs Q is the use of the he pronoun. Actually, does that out him as gay or bisexual? Not necessarily. It might be his friend. Yes, his friend. And obvious, that's very obviously not intended to be the case in instance, but particularly in times through cinema, social and cinematic history, when we couldn't explicitly name it. Whenever Hitchcock was like Fleming, Hitchcock, for a straight man, was obsessed with homosexuality, and he brings it up a lot, and he always refers to it as it. And when he was making Rope, so I know you're a huge Psycho fan. Do you like Rope as well?
Oh yes, very much so. Yeah.
So I didn't even realize, I'll be honest, when I was first getting into Hitchcock as a teen, I didn't realize Rope was a big gay film. So I don't know how I missed it because the coding is pretty obvious. You've got two men living together they've got one bedroom. They make a point of showing there's only one bedroom. They for some reason, they are complicit in murdering their friend, and they've got a very obviously gay coded professor, and it was based on a real life story of two gay men murdering one of their friends and getting their real life gay professor involved. So but Hitchcock couldn't, in 1948 Rope, I think, something like that.
Yeah, I think you bang on.
Yeah, I can generally remember film dates, but so Rope, Hitchcock couldn't refer to it explicitly, and it's the same in a lot of his films. You've got a lot of queer coded characters. So to bring that back to Bond, on A Majesty's Secret Service, which a lot of people forget was directed by a gay man, so perhaps had a bit more insight into how to go about gay coding a character, has George Lazenby play, for about 40 minutes of the film, a gay character who is coded as such when we first meet him. So Hilary Bray, when we first meet him, talks about getting lost. Is it some churches somewhere, doing some brass rubbings, which is not the. No, I don't think brass rubbings are an especially gay pastime.
However, yourself.
We should go and do some brass rubbings, Galore. But it's not an obviously masculine pastime as well, and that's where we tie up sexual orientation with gender, and everything gets kind of muddled together there. But it does play on the stereotype of a gay man, and especially as Bond plays Bray, he is physically quite weak. He's always moaning about his ailments when he's going up in the helicopter to Irma Bunt, and he kind of makes out that he's immune to he doesn't use that word, but during the dinner scene. So it's a playful kind of stereotype of a gay man, I think, going on, which isn't really there in the book. So it's sort of something that the filmmakers, as I say, including Peter Hunt, who edited the first 5 Bond movies and then directed that one himself, I think I think in hindsight you're supposed to recognize what's going on there. Again, I don't think I necessarily did when I was a child.
Oh no, definitely not. I'm glad that you touched on the book there as well, because that is something that I think a lot of the characters that we're talking about, it's very much there in the Fleming books, and the filmmakers are sort of adapting it in the ways in which they could do it, depending on the censors at the time and whatnot. With Hilary Bray in the book, I think he is just an eccentric, like he's going to Scotland, some remote Scotland cave or something, to basically be out of the way while Bond impersonates him. I think he's interesting in the film. There are several lines, from some of the women at Piz Gloria where they say, "Oh, but I didn't think you liked girls, Hilly," and of
course I know what he's allergic to, which is isn't that one of Joanna Lumley's lines?
Yes, I think,
or the only Joanna Lumley line. I can't remember. I'm sure she's got 2.
Yeah.
But of course I know what he's allergic to.
Yes, exactly. Which is probably the point where it just almost tips over from subtext into text, I think. But I had a conversation on Twitter recently where I saw a couple of people sort of say that they didn't think that Hilary Bray was a queer character in Bond, and I have thought of him as that for some time now, because I think so many of the hints are there. There's that Blofeld line where I think he says something like, when he's confronting Bond when Bond's been rumbled, and he says something like, respected members of the College of Arms would not go around sleeping around and all that, which at the time when I'm watching this as a kid, not really thinking about these things, I think I probably took that line as face value. Now when I hear that line, I kind of think of it as, Blofeld saying it in an almost knowing kind of way, like, respected member of the College of Arms wouldn't be sleeping around, like he knows that the original Hilary Bray's gay. And there is that deleted scene as well, which I don't know if you know about his assistant. When Bond comes into the room, initially there's an assistant there with the Bond coat of arms, I think, and the assistant leaves. There was like a whole deleted scene, which was, I think, half. You what? Sorry.
Isn't he listening in on them or something?
Yes, that's exactly the one, and it provoked like a bit of a chase over the rooftops. And I think they filmed a load of the location stuff. They cut it before they filmed like the studio set stuff. The underground, and that in itself is kind of, because I think that assistant gifted Hilary Bray some kind of statue, which was like a microphone kind of thing, and he was listening in through that. And I think there was some kind of implication there that this assistant, who was obviously a double agent, was sort of wooing Sir Hilary and sort of getting into his sort of circle of trust that way, which I think would have been really interesting if that had been kept in the film.
Yeah, definitely. And there you've got that would have been fascinating. I didn't know that element of it. So I've seen the photos and I knew a little bit about that scene, but I now need to look more into that one, definitely. But it's interesting that kind of association that even a gay man making that film would make the queer characters kind of shifty, and which is sort of reflective of how a lot of people would have viewed queer characters and spies. And it's quite interesting. Fleming sometimes himself makes the connection between traitors and queer people, which were news headlines in the 1950s and 60s. So it would have been interesting to see a bit more of that in the films.
Totally. But I think Sir Hilary Bray himself is like, I mean, I know he is only in that one scene, but he is a positive portrayal, I suppose. Yeah. I don't think of him as being terribly problematic or anything like that. I did also want to ask about, this is something that I really wanted to know about. He has a ring on his little finger on his left hand, which I believe is some kind of like coding going on, right? Like that was a symbol at the time, or it could have been interpreted as a symbol at the time of him.
I've only just finished looking into this actually, because I looked into it because I've just done the Die Another Day queer review, which I think actually ended up being the longest one that I've done so far. And one of the sections I ended up writing about 1,000 words about which thing you put your ring on. I've got to be careful how we phrase this section, by the way. But yeah, essentially, obviously, we know wedding rings go on that finger, and the reason I talked about the Die Another Day is because Bond is given the ring that can destroy glass, essentially on that ring there. And then I started, and oh my gosh, it was like there's so much material on this about the signification of different fingers. The one that the only sort of consensus I found for any kind of historical kind of period of time and across queer communities is thumb rings. So if you wear one on your thumb, that seems to be a queer signifier. But I'm not an expert on this at all. As I say, I feel like even just what I did with Dino today scratches the surface. But I think that probably, as I say, directed by a gay man, he would have known those things. So he would have perhaps directed the production design, the costume design to do that. So yeah, that probably is a coded reference for those in the know in the audience. Yeah, I'll have to have a look at that one.
Yeah, interesting. I was at the BFI screening a couple of years ago now. They did like a 50th anniversary screening of Majesty's Secret Service, and they had a Q&A with George Lazenby, which was really interesting. And he mentioned at a few points that Peter Hunt was gay and that he had like gay friends on the set quite regularly, which I thought was quite interesting.
Including one of the co-writers. So again, it was one of those times where I just kind of picked away at something and then found loads and ended up reading some of his books. But Simon Raven, who is credited with additional dialogue at the start, was a gay man and one of his friends, and he wrote the scene. He wrote many of Tracy's scenes, but particularly the So Poetic a Pleasure, where she quotes poetry to distract Blofeld. So he wrote that scene. So yeah, he definitely had his queer friends on the set.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Huh. Okay, well, let's move on then to, I think, a couple of the most prominent, like openly gay characters in all of Bond, Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd in Diamonds Are Forever, which just, by the way, we're 7 films in now, and 4 of them at least have like coded or very obviously queer characters, which I think is, quite significant. So Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, obviously they're adapted from the Ian Fleming book, where they're described very differently. I more thuggish, I want to say, in the book. They're very much like American gangsters, really, aren't they?
Arguably, they're not even gay in the book, because Leiter says that he thinks they probably shack up together. And then he says, homos make the worst killers. I couldn't resist it. When I reread Diamonds of Forever, I read that line, I burst out laughing, and then thought I need to write an article just with that as the heading, which I did. So homos are the worst killers is probably my most detailed discussion about Wint and Kidd, and I've had a few. So they're arguably not even together in the book. So it's just what Felix surmises. And I know we don't have time to do this today, but there's a whole other podcast about Felix and queer readings and coding and everything else to go on there. My conclusion is that, it takes one to know one, Felix. He's gaydars pinging, clearly. Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd in the film, anyway, a lot of people say that they're very problematic, and they are, and that's one of the reasons why the BBFC re-rated the film in this country. So the censors have upped the certificate, which is very rare, very rarely happens, partly because of the sexism, but also because of the negative portrayals of homosexuals. But I've got to admit, as a kid, I think they were probably the first, and this probably explains a lot about my psychology, they were probably the first gay characters I saw on anything, TV show, film. And yes, they aren't very nice people, but at least they're together and they love each other. So yeah, that probably set that to probably a distressing degree. That probably set a template for my life.
You know what? I've never thought about it like that before, but you're absolutely right. I can't think of any instance where I would have seen an obvious gay couple on film, TV, whatever. And it is very obvious. I mean, they are holding hands. They, again, this isn't subtext reading. I don't think this is very much obvious. I think it's to your point about them being problematic. Yes, but they are most people's favorite thing in Diamonds Are Forever, and I think mine included. As much as I do love Charles Gray and Tiffany Case and so many elements about that film, it's always quite. I always quite like it when people talk very fondly of them. In fact, I very seldom see any kind of negative discussion about them in the fandom.
No, I'm exactly the same. I mean, there's actually a gay journalist, Adam Bloodworth, who I contributed to a couple of his articles last year, and he actually interviewed Putter Smith and Bruce Glover for his article to kind of see how it was taken now. But even like in the noughties, when there were those behind the scenes documentaries on the DVDs and things, Bruce Glover, particularly Bruce Glover, because he was, he's the actor, and Putter Smith obviously is a jazz musician. He's not actually an actor, but he does really well in the role. But both of them really committed to playing it straight, for want of a better phrase, that they did actually love each other. And Glover himself says that the way I played it was he's mine, he is mine. We are together in a relationship, and I'm just going to play it like that. So they're playing a gay couple in a relationship, which for 1971 must have been pretty rare, bearing in mind that in this country, 4 years before, homosexuality was illegal. So to actually put two men in a long-term loving relationship, yes, they're serial killers, but as I often say, nobody's perfect. It must have been quite revolutionary and very brave for those actors to take on that role.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And as I say, they're certainly my favorite thing in that whole film. I appreciate and understand that part of their creepiness, or their intended creepiness, comes from the fact that they are a same-sex couple. But I don't know. I think it's, to your point, I think the actors play it straight enough that I don't read it as problematic as perhaps something like Goldfinger these days.
I think the key to it is, and the ending is really homophobic. Okay, we can't get away from where it leads. you know. And actually, I even did really nice guys on Really 007. We did like a 10.5 hour dissection of Diamonds Are Forever, but none of those had really thought about the ending. And I've heard this from quite a lot of straight Bond fans. They don't really understand what's going on at the end, or at least they're pretending not to know what's going on at the end. It's like James Bond is essentially having sex with him, or at least stimulating his prostate. I'm going to keep the language family friendly. So that's essentially what's going on there. And it's playing on that stereotype of only gay men will feel pleasure in this way sort of idea. That's always how I've taken that ending anyway. But I think the key go on.
No, sorry, no, go on, I interrupted.
I think the key for me is how they're actually introduced. So the dentist, the dodgy dentist at the start, when he sees that they're together, he goes, "Oh, I see." And actually we're not on the dentist's side, we're on their side. And we actually, it's a nice, I think it's quite cathartic that the dentist then ends up dead, because it puts us on the side of Wint and Kid. We almost like, yeah, the homophobe deserves to die.
Oh, that's so true. I'd never considered that. But I think you're completely right about the ending as well. I think it is that kind of ooh moment, that particularly because it follows just after he sees his partner like jump over the side of the boat in flames and all that kind of stuff. And you have a moment where it's on like Bruce Glover to kind of like, and you can see that he is pained at that sight. Yeah. And the fact that
so well played,
they take a moment for that. And I think that's really quite nice, actually, that it shows that like, it is just a twinge of like, oh, you do feel a bit sorry for the guy in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it's just a shame that they kind of follow it up with that really broad comedic bit.
Like Carry On film by that point.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I do want to just touch on Charles Gray's Blofeld here, because this is definitely potentially a coded thing if it's there at all. But Charles Gray, very camp performer, I think. So much about him from his Bond films, Rocky Horror Picture Show. Just his voice, his everything about him just exudes camp for me, and that comes through in Blofeld. And I think his Blofeld is one of my favorites as a result of that. I don't know if he's supposed to be gay. And it's just like just the fact that they have that actor cast in that role just makes you think about these things. But it does affect the film. There are moments like towards the end where he has Tiffany Case captive on the oil rig. I think if you'd have had, he's just kind of got her hanging around in a bikini. If that had been Telly Savalas's Blofeld, I think I would have been a bit more like, oh, I'm very concerned for her, actually, because God knows what he's, wanting to. It would have felt like a Largo and Domino kind of situation. Because it's Charles Gray, I don't have any sort of feeling of like, she just looks like she's having a fairly good time on this oil rig sunbathing and whatnot. And I get the sense that she's not being forced into any kind of horrible kind of sexual situations the way that I might have done with a different Blofeld. So in a sense, it takes away from a bit of the menace of that situation at the end. But at the same time, I do love Charles Gray's Blofeld. Anyway, I just wanted to get your take on that, if you have a take.
Yeah, so just to take a jump to the left.
Yay!
Couldn't resist, sorry. I agree with everything you've just said, and I think that it would have been probably uncomfortable in a bad way to have that that sexual overtone from the ending, which is, you're right, it's completely absent. Charles Gray was a gay man. We have to be careful because he never wrote an autobiography and never outed himself publicly. But a lot of these friends who particularly those who live within London, have written about him being gay in their books. So I think we're on pretty safe ground there. And of course, you don't have to be, he wouldn't have to be gay in real life to play a gay character. I think he's very gay in Diamonds Are Out. I'm not even sure it's coded. A lot of people jump straight to the drag scene, which I've kind of started to think, is it even really a drag scene? Because he's a terrible, terrible drag queen. Absolutely no taste whatsoever. He'd be off RuPaul's Drag Race in the first week if he was on there. So and I sort of, yeah, so moving past the terrible drag, for me it's the kind of shadiness of the character and everything he says, which is like a withering put down. I did an article called 15 Shades of Grey, again a title I couldn't resist, and then wrote the article to match. So, but it had been in my head for some time, because so many of the almost half of his dialogue is like a put down of someone or somewhere, like the one about Kansas. No one will have heard about it. I love all that. But I think there's quite a revealing line towards the end where he's going back to what you said about Tiffany. He says, when he says we're showing a bit more cheek than usual, aren't we? He then follows it with, what a pity, such nice cheeks too, if only they were brains. For me, and it's there in Fleming as well, particularly in Thunderball, there's a hint that Blofeld might be sapiosexual, which is a term I only learned a few years ago, a term for people are attracted to people's intelligence. So I think that's sort of where they're going with that character. That definitely puts him under the queer umbrella. But there are also those wonderful lines about the farcical show of force, about the military, the great powers flexing their military muscles like so many impotent beach boys. He's satirizing all that kind of masculine energy. And for me, I think that yeah, it is coded, it is, but obviously he's and we'll probably get to this when we come back to Q, but he's a cat dad as well. So cats are historically stereotypical, kind of more of a feminine thing. But, you know, so many people say he's not a physical threat in that movie. And I always hate that kind of argument. But I also hate the argument that people have a problem with Blofeld being different in every one of the films, because obviously played by a different actor until, you know, Christoph Waltz played him twice. But in Fleming's books, Blofeld is different in every book as well. It's almost like there is not a stable character. So that's what I like about Blofeld as a whole. And Charles Gray's version of Blofeld is by far my favorite. I know he came high in your rankings as well.
So we're going to be taking a bit of a leap forward in time now. And we're going to hopefully come back to, if we have time, to talk about some of the more minor characters scattered throughout the series, because I think really next it goes to Silva in Skyfall as being one of the more obvious queer characters, or hinted at, in the Bond series, with the famous scene where he has Bond tied up in the chair and he's sort of touching his legs, he's like opening up his shirt and sort of like caressing him. I think it's more than implied, I think, that he does have some kind of sexual relationship with Severin as well. So I don't know if it's a bisexual that they're kind of hinting at. But yeah, what's your take on that character and that scene in particular?
For me, when you know, I've done it quite a lot already as we've been talking, trying to kind of put people into different boxes and things like that. I think the thing with Bond is that it's very good at opening up possibilities. And a couple of other writers on the website have explored this, particularly Kathleen Jowett in her articles. She's explored who she identifies as bisexual herself, and she's found all these moments in Bond films and books where it opens up possibilities but never closes them down by putting a label on it. I think just going right back to the article that's just been published in The Guardian, I think that writer might have been a bit annoyed because Q didn't have a gay pride flag up in his apartment, or he didn't say, yes, James Bond, I am gay. But the great thing is with that scene that Bond just sort of moves past it and just kind of accepts it, really. He doesn't deny it, just kind of, yeah, whatever. And it's sort of the same thing with the Silva scene, because Silva wonderfully thinks he's intimidating Bond, but actually Bond couldn't give two hoots. You know, what makes you think it's my first time? It's like, and I love my favorite part of that scene is when Silva responds, "Oh, Mr. Bond." So he behaves like the stereotypical Bond girl. So he kind of positions himself, and then they're of course talking, and it's not really even coding, is it? They're talking about in this duel scene later. They talk about eating each other in that bit, but then in the duel scene, who gets to be on top? And you just think, okay, all right, they're having a field day here. And again, that scene was largely written by a gay screenwriter who was a bit cagey at the time of release. about talking about, pinning it down, and then fairly recently, a few months ago, came out and said, no, this was intended to be a homoerotic moment in a Bond film. So a decade later has been a bit more kind of willing to put a label on it.
No, and because I kind of like typed up a bit of a running order of the discussion points that we were going to have throughout this video, and just when I was rereading it before we jumped on, I can't believe that I missed Bond himself out as a result of, from that conversation as well, like his comeback to, and I know that this has been a subject of discussion in the fandom, like, is Bond actually referring to, queer experiences that he's had in the past, or is this just kind of, psyching Silva out, kind of playing in his own game kind of thing? I think it's obviously open to interpretation, but being a spy and being known for getting information out of characters through seducing them, it wouldn't surprise me if at some point in time one or more of those people were male.
Absolutely. That's what I want in a Bond film. We have the scene where, actually, did you ever watch the TV series Alias?
No, I didn't. No.
No. So that was interesting because it was sort of a female James Bond series with Jennifer Garner in the lead. But there was also a male lead played by Michael Vartan, I want to say. And there was a brilliant scene in a nightclub where they actually did that scenario, where for once it wasn't her using her sexuality. It was like, oh, and by the way, he's gay. So it's like, oh, okay, fine. So he had to be the one to seduce the villain. So the straight male character had to do it. But even so, I'm not even sure that this, and again, this might be me projecting onto the character, which we all do, but I'm not even sure Bond would, just have to do it for the mission. I think that I take that line as meaning, no, I've had same-sex experiences. What of it?
Yeah. Well, on the subject of him flirting with male characters, then that's probably a good segue to talking about Ben Whishaw's Q, because I mean, obviously there is No Time to Die, and we'll talk about that, but something happens in Spectre which I never really picked up on until it was pointed out to me as sort of hinting towards Ben Wishaw's Q's sexuality. There's a bit where just after he's put the smart blood thing in Bond, and I can't remember exactly what the line is, but Q starts acting very flustered all of a sudden, and he's a little bit like, oh, well, and I've never quite understood exactly what that moment's getting at. And someone pointed out, it might have even been an article on your site, actually, David, so I might have that to thank, that Q is being a bit flustered because Bond is kind of turning on the charm. And indeed, Craig, in that moment, he's rolling down his sleeve and he's just like, again, I can't remember exactly what the line is, but whatever it does prompt a flustered reaction from Ben Whishaw. Did that ever stand out to you?
Yeah, definitely. If I remember correctly, the line is, you may feel a small prick.
Yep.
And there's that momentary pause just before, and their eyes meet. For me, it's actually the scene after that. I think it's after that. I need to rewatch Spectre.
Brave decision.
So I think it's the scene after that where Bond is persuading Q to turn off is it Smart Blood Inspector, whatever it is, the same track. They have trackings in the last three Bond movies, don't they? So it's essentially the Smart Blood tracking system. It's like, oh, it'll be glitching for the next 48 hours. So he persuades him to kind of essentially give him a bit more license. And it's so flirty. He is, that's probably the flirtiest scene, I think, apart from when they initially meet in Skyfall, because the dialogue about pulling triggers in your pajamas in Skyfall has always made me think there's more going on here, isn't there? Yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
If you the dialogue is like, well, sometimes a trigger has to be pulled, Q says, and Bond says, or not pulled, and then Bond says, Daniel Craig performs it in the most kind of seductive fashion possible. It's hard to know which, in your pajamas. And I'm just like, why give that line that intonation? And I know a lot of, because there are a lot of people who ship Bond and Q online, hashtag #00Q. And there's actually, someone actually wrote a story for the website. Gilles Lefleur wrote one fairly recently, which was brilliant. And I know a lot of people who love #00Q, that ship, take that line and go, okay, why are they talking about pulling triggers in pajamas? Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yeah, no, I hadn't considered that, and it feels weird when looking at that Guardian article in particular, where Ben Whishaw sort of talks about his reaction to seeing it in the No Time to Die script, that they were going to reference his date as being a man, and I guess it surprised me because I wondered what did he think was happening in those scenes in Spectre where he was acting a bit flustered and Bond was sort of persuading him to do things, because I think he plays it quite like flustered and as if he's being flirted with. And that's really the only way that I can read some of those scenes now. Like I say, particularly after the smart blood has immediately gone in and he's acting sort of flustered for, as far as I can tell, no good reason other than he's being flirted with and he's nervous about that.
I think it was definitely intended from the beginning. I mean, Ben Whishaw himself, and they talk about this in this article, he's not exactly reticent to talk about his own sexual orientation, his identity as a gay man. And he has played quite a few roles, including really early in his career, but he didn't actually come out until he was 26. Not that it's ever a competition or anything, but which is funnily enough, exactly the same age I came out. So, and Ben Wishaw's a couple of years older than me. But we're sort of, we're of that kind of same generation. And I wonder if they might have gone there a bit sooner if Whishaw had been more comfortable. I don't know.
Possibly. That's interesting. Because I mean, it certainly is most obvious, I would say, in No Time to Die, where they have the line where he's expecting a date. It's clearly, I think, from the way he's, doing his hair and just before he answers the door, it's a romantic date. So I think there are candles on the table. It's, it's clearly
posh bottle of wine, which is exactly, this is really nerdy. But I was actually sitting on a coach going through Bordeaux sometime last year. We managed to escape for a couple of days. And I was looking up these things as the French countryside kind of whizzed past in the rain. And that bottle of wine that Q has is exactly the same bottle of wine that Madeleine and Bond have in Spectre. So a romance, and it's also a later vintage of the same wine that Bond and did I just say Bond and Madeleine? No, Bond and Madeleine Spectre, and then Bond and Vesper in Casino Royale as well.
Wow.
So Bond's big committed relationship people, that's the wine for romance, apparently.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that. That's really
probably mostly an accident of product placement, but it's a nice connection anyway.
Amazing. Okay, well, how did you react to that scene when you first saw it? Because I've certainly had whenever I was doing video reviews of No Time to Die and whatnot, I had some messages and comments from people saying, "Oh, I can't believe you didn't talk about they confirmed Q's gay in this one," which I guess I didn't talk about it because it is such a subtle point, and it doesn't have anything to do with the story or the plot at all. And I know that this Guardian article makes a comment about maybe Safin should have turned up as being Q's date, which, God, I can't imagine what trajectory the film would have gone on if that had been the case. Could you imagine? But again, this obviously isn't you don't hold it up as a great representation of queer person in media, but I kind of like how subtle it is. It's in keeping with the previous few films where we see Moneypenny with a date over presumably in her apartment. We see Judi Dench's M in bed with a man, and we hear his voice off screen in another film. And I think it fits in nicely with that, as just giving these little pepperings of character, of personality to those MI6 regulars. And I suppose my main contention with this article is that I kind of don't mind that it is just a very small detail. I didn't need or want it to be a plot dependent thing because the film isn't about Q. And I appreciated that little acknowledgement. I think we're on a relatively similar page with this. Yeah,
you might expect me to disagree because I own and run a website called License to Queer. So, that's the whole thing, notice my bookshelves, so I totally believe in affirmative action, and, we do have to kind of overstate the case sometimes. And there's definitely a place for that. But as you may know, I work in education. I do a lot of training for school leaders on how to not normalize LGBTQ in schools, but I prefer the term, and I think it was the person who created LGBT History Month, I think she came up with it, but to usualize the experiences of LGBTQ people. So like in our workplaces, you know, not just us, other queer people exist. You know, that is a reality. Like in the real MI6, other queer people exist. Queer people exist in society, you know, and that's what we mean by usualizing. It's like they have existed, they have always existed, which is why LGBT History Month exists, because for so long we've been written out of history. But that right now, here and now, we exist. And yes, you don't want to have to play the pronoun game and say, oh, I'm having someone round for dinner soon. No, he'll be round soon. And I think that's the way to do it. I think one of the telling remarks in that article, which the writer sort of, there's clearly a car chase going on past my house right now. I'm just going.
That sounds exciting.
I know. Probably not. It's like it's not the opening of No Time to Die with a bike stunt. I don't think. I think it's an idiot going down the canal on their moped or something. But yeah, what was I saying about? What was I saying? I've just lost my train of thought. Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I think one of the telling remarks was from in that article, which the writer sort of skipped past, was that Ben Whishaw said that he'd had a text message from Russell T Davies, who is probably most famous for Queer as Folk and Doctor Who and It's a Sin most recently. One of the best things that Russell T Davies did with Doctor Who was just do that usualizing of queer people's experiences. So one of my favorite episodes of Doctor Who, there's a female character and she just talks about a wife, just completely naturalistically, just falls out of conversation. The Doctor doesn't respond. And it's that sort of thing that I think is the real strength of that scene in No Time to Die.
I completely agree. And I think it's, I certainly, I mean, it's the age of the media landscape that we live in, where anything like this that isn't sort of straight and white is, potentially, you see videos talking about, oh, the woke takeover and all that kind of stuff. I think it's quite telling that I haven't seen like anything regarding Q in No Time to Die, and other than like this article, which is I think why it kind of struck me a bit, that like, oh god, the sort of the most negative take of that I'm seeing is from an article involving the actor himself, which is part of what prompted my desire to kind of have this conversation, really, because I think it's a really nice moment in the film. I think it's kind of a shame that the biggest sort of cloud of negativity has come from that article and the other articles sort of reacting to it.
As I said earlier, I think it was the writer decide, they've got their take on it, and clearly they think that they clearly aren't a big Bond fan, because the way they write about the characters being playing second fiddle essentially to all the explosions and whatever, which obviously I don't agree with as a big queer Bond fan. But I think a lot of queer commentators don't like Bond because that's all they see. They only see the kind of heteronormative version of Bond, and that's what I've been trying to do. And this is, why this conversation is great, because it will hopefully make more people realize that the queer characters have always been in there in Bond. And I think that writer went in with a certain viewpoint and they'd never seen that before. Who knows? That writer might see this video and go, oh, actually, I maybe did completely look past all of those other queer characters.
Well, speaking of looking past other queer characters, I do want to just like briefly touch on kind of more minor characters. I think that we've focused on most of the major ones throughout the Bond series. There are some, I think of the hotelier in Moonraker as being this sort of Kenneth Williams-esque performance that he gives, as being another one. Yeah.
I haven't actually done. I think I've got 8 left of the queer reviews, and they are taking longer and longer because the pieces are getting longer and longer now. But when I eventually get round to Moonraker, I'm going to do a proper exploration of him. But I have already touched on that character type a little bit. Long story short, sissy characters used to exist in Hollywood cinema in the first half of the 20th century. And of course, we know them from British carry-on films of the 60s. But a sissy character was essentially a way of having a gay character in a story, but essentially neutering them, making them not allowing them to have a sex life, essentially, so that they aren't threatening in any way. So you make them a figure of fun, and that's what that hotelier is. And actually, someone recently posted the pages from the script from Moonraker online, and it's there in the script. It was written it's not just in the performance. That character, and I can't remember the actor's name, but that character is actually played by a straight man. But it was written as an effeminate kind of gay sissy stereotype.
Interesting, because I think it's kind of fascinating to, even when I was like typing up the list of discussion points for this, like you have a lot of characters like front loaded in the series, really. Like I say, in those first 7 films, 4 of them have quite prominent queer characters, and then I think we see that again in the more recent films with Silva and Q. There is like a period in time where very little kind of acknowledgement of any kind of queer community.
And it coincides with the Roger Moore era. So this is the weird thing, because I love Roger Moore. You know, I love all the Bonds. If anyone ever asks who's my favorite Bond, I give a completely non-committal answer, because I love them all. And I really, really I know you love Roger Moore as well. But his films are actually probably the least queer, even though a lot of people say they are camp. And there is a kind of Venn diagram overlap of queer and camp. There definitely is, but they are probably the least queer in the sense of they're actually kind of exploring identity. They're much more kind of sure of themselves in terms of their identity. And Bond has sex with probably more women in those movies than the others. And it's almost kind of that hyper masculinity. And I think it was probably reflective of what was going on politically. Not sure about the late 80s, but 70s, sorry, but certainly in the 1980s. And I love all of those 80s Roger Moore movies, particularly A View to a Kill, but they
that's brave.
Let's just move past. But I love all of those movies, but they are very heteronormative and but at the same time quite camp. So I think that's kind of the appeal of those. But that was very reflective of what was going on politically in the US and the UK, certainly. So obviously in the mid and latter part of the decade, you have the AIDS crisis. But you know, it was not a good time for gay rights, the 1980s. So I think that's probably why you don't really get many queer characters in the 1980s Bond films.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because that era of Bond is often, you know, defined as being quite campy, and certainly the Roger Moore era anyway. And yet, as you say, there's like nothing really as far as queer elements in there. It's there is this recurring thing that I'd love to get your take on, of the blonde, seemingly asexual, very muscular kind of assassin type character. I think Red Grant, Necros, Kriegler in For Your Eyes Only.
Hands in You Only Live Twice.
Yep, there we go. Hands.
Stamper in Tomorrow Never Dies.
There we go. It's endless. Like, one of the things that a lot of these characters have in common is they're seemingly completely disinterested in the very attractive females around them. I think of Necros in the swimming pool. He's just there doing laps. There are all these beautiful women around. Koskov is like, I think he's being fed grapes or something by women around him. Necros is just doing his athletic thing. I think of Kriegler in For Your Eyes Only. Fair enough, BB is very young and annoying, so perhaps that would explain his disinterest in her there.
Yeah, it's not just her though. We are told that Kriegler, he doesn't even speak to girls.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Yeah, exactly. Okay, then that perhaps that's a bit more coded for him than some of the others.
Yeah, I think Kriegler probably is the most. I don't know, Kriegler or Stamper. I don't know. Yeah. I love Stamper. That might be something to do with the actor who plays him. But yes, I've spent a long time looking at Stamper. So, like you with Necros, I think, from Living Daylights Review, for reasons. Yeah. So, blondness has often been. I did write a short article about this. I did, and I have analysed those individual characters. But I think there's probably still more to say. A blondness has often been connoted with being less masculine than dark hair color, and this even goes back to Roman times, because Romans had predominantly dark hair, and that's where we get a lot of our ideas about masculinity. And an obvious example is when Daniel Craig was cast, and he's blonde. You know, he was less of a man because he had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he couldn't drive a car that wasn't an automatic, and I'm trying to remember all the other stupid reasons, but sort of hovering. I always got when in the early 2000s, I always thought hovering in the background there was almost that accusation of Daniel Craig's a bit gay, or he's less of a man, and from the tabloid press. Yeah, definitely, but it's definitely there in those villains as well. I mean, Red Grant, he's a very, very queer character in lots of ways. Not quite as queer as he is in the novel, where he howls at the moon and various other strange Fleming traits. But yeah, blondness is usually connoted with femininity in Bond.
I'd love to see how Red Grant, like what happens when he follows Nash into the public toilets in Russia with Love.
That is an extremely interesting scene, because even the person who played, he was actually someone on the production, and again, I've forgotten his name, but the person who plays Nash himself said, why on earth would he be going into the toilet? It makes absolutely no sense. And I think Peter Hunt, the gay editor, I think he himself says something about that on the commentary as well. It makes no sense, I don't think, unless you kind of think, because you never hear that dialogue. But if you could easily replace that dialogue with some kind of flirty kind of come on. And I wrote about this in my From Russia with Love piece. You know, essentially this could be read, certainly at the time in the early 60s, as two gay men deciding to meet in a public convenience because they couldn't meet anywhere else.
Interesting. Okay, so we're kind of at the end of my list here. Are there any characters that you feel we've missed that you'd like to bring
One
up?
or two.
Oh, okay. Great. Okay.
So Henderson in You Only Live Twice. Again, played by Charles Gray, who knows what he gets from the doorman at the Russian embassy, amongst certain other things, which I love, because in the novel, Henderson is this really brash kind of Australian, quite xenophobic, homophobic. He even calls Bond a pufter at one point. And then in the movie, the character is totally different and played by gay man Charles Gray, who probably has sex with the Russian doorman, or at least procures sex from the Russian doorman. You've got, I think, Lock-in. We said 1980s is pretty much a wasteland as far as queer characters, but I think Lock-in For Your Eyes Only is quite queer coded, and he's sort of got the blonde thing going on as well. But again, he's not interested in the girls around the pool, similar to Necros. So I think he's probably one of the most queer coded in the Roger Moore era. I've got to say, Sanchez in License to Queer, that's me, License to Kill, has always struck me as a queer character. And I'm not just talking about a pink shirt. He's very flirty with Dario. And I know you could say that's, part of a cultural difference there. But a lot of his henchmen, particularly Perez, who's played by a bisexual actor, he's very jealous of Sanchez's proximity with Bond, physical and kind of in terms of trust. We've got to have some women in here. Miranda Frost. I've just spent ages researching Miranda Frost, and you could put her in various boxes, from asexual, lesbian, bisexual. I think the film mostly goes for lesbian. Someone actually only this morning pointed out on Twitter the scene where Jinx appears at the Ice Palace and Miranda's checking her out, which I completely missed on my own. Even though I've looked at that film in forensic detail, I still miss those bits. So I love it when people play those bits. And just the last couple, Xenia Onatopp. Now, you and I love Xenia Onatopp.
Yes.
Okay. And I think one of the reasons, and this is the reason I first contacted you nearly 2 years ago, because I was like, surely I'm not the only gay man who always played as Xenia in Goldeneye. So what were your thoughts on that?
On what? Playing Xenia?
Yeah. Why did we always pick Xenia?
It's obviously something going on, like, because I've been playing GoldenEye since I was like, 8, 9, 10 years old, something like that, and just always being drawn to. And it's a similar thing with a few gay men that I know, where you gravitate towards some of the female character options for some reason. I was always Princess Peach in Mario Kart, Xenia in GoldenEye, in Nightfire when she appears again in that game, and I don't know why exactly there was always some like magnetism with her, but I guess you felt the same.
I either played as Princess Peach in Mario Kart or Yoshi. So the othered characters, the people who weren't recognized, because Yoshi's always a bit effeminate, isn't he, as well? So there's definitely something there. And I think it's probably because perhaps a lot of gay men don't necessarily identify with those typical versions of masculinity, that kind of alpha male masculinity. We want a different version. I think that's why a lot of us like James Bond, to be honest, because I know a lot of people say he's the ultimate man, but actually he's got a lot of qualities that are not stereotypically very masculine. And I always think Bond is, right from Dr. No, I always think Bond is kind of that perfect kind of combination of masculine and feminine. But going back to Xenia, yeah, totally. And I think she's coded as queer, I think, in her clothing particularly. She smokes cigars, so quite masculine. She has her martinis straight up. There's a weird thing, this is a whole other podcast, but there's a whole thing about martini drinking in Bond, and it's being seen as quite masculine unless you are the one. So, Vesper and Madeline both like martinis, whereas most of the, like Pam Bouvier in License to Kill hates martinis. She pulls that sour face. So I think Bond only falls truly in love with women who can, down a martini like a man, which, let's face it, a martini is not a terribly mask drink, is it? Let's be honest, apart from being incredibly strong. But anyway, Xenia likes martinis. And actually, in the uncut version of the film, there is a little bit of more of a fight with Natalia, which got cut out of the original UK version because they said it was a bit too violent. But also, I think there was a degree of, oh God, this is queering sexuality quite a lot. Because when Natalia tries to hit her with a big log, she grabs hold of Natalia and holds her face up to her and says, "Wait your turn." Which is the worst Xenia impression you've probably ever heard.
That was pretty good. And then she like headbutts her, doesn't she? Which is the reason why that bit was cut from a lot of the
But I do think it wasn't just the headbutt. I think it's kind of like, this is a bit too, this is a bit too much lesbianism. So there is that kind of double standard with censorship as well. And also, I noticed, I've been looking through some of the publicity photos for the Bond films recently and how the kind of campaigns change over time. It wasn't just GoldenEye, because it was starting to happen with License to Kill as well. But certainly from GoldenEye onwards, an awful lot of publicity photos put the women in quite provocative positions with each other that you never get with the men. So it's almost like they were kind of playing into that straight male fantasy of, it would be, going back to Fleming, wouldn't it be fun to kind of turn a lesbian? So I think that's been going on for some time. I've got one more, and I don't know, I'm almost pained to bring this one up.
Okay.
I really don't feel represented by him. Who do you think I'm talking about?
Oh, give me a clue. Which? Oh no, not Elvis. I always forget he exists.
I'm sorry.
Oh dear.
So, as you know, I did my Quantum of Solace in-depth review, and it was one of the more in-depth ones. I actually didn't spend that long on Elvis because I didn't want to. So he's an interesting character, but I think when we talk about coding, okay, you add it all up and you go, okay, we know where we're going here. So we meet him, he's having a kind of disagreement, intense conversation with his mom on the phone. So there's the stereotype about mother obsessed. And yeah, there's a weird dynamic between him and Green. He's drinking pina coladas in the party scene later on. Now, I'm not a big fan of pina coladas, to be perfectly honest, or getting caught in the rain, for that matter. But and then there is that sequence of shots where he looks during the opera sequence. He's quite moved by the opera, which is totally gay. If you're going to cry at an opera or be moved by it, you're totally gay. Absolutely. So he's moved by that, and then he looks back at one of the other henchmen who's completely unmoved, smiles at him, and then turns away again. So it's kind of like there's something going on there. I suppose the reason he can't, on the flip side, he can't really be a stereotypical gay man because he has a really awful haircut. But That's about it, really.
Well, it's a wig, isn't it? There's again, I'm not going to go on a tirade about the appalling editing in Quantum of Solace, but that moment where Strawberry Fields knocks him over and he falls down the stairs, you actually see it's poorly lit. You can't see it, but his like toupee sort of like flops off.
Oh, I didn't
like
know that.
So yeah, I know it literally like years later that I picked up on that, and again after someone else pointed it out. So I mean, he's got that vanity thing going on. He's wearing a toupee.
I don't think I've got any more, but as soon as we finish recording, I have a horrible feeling I'll have forgotten someone. So maybe people in the comments will be able to kind of name the ones we forgot.
Yeah, I think that's quite extensive. And I guess to wrap up this conversation, just to talk very briefly about what the future of queer characters in the series might be like if Ben Whishaw does indeed come back as Q again. Would they continue, going with him, or will we one day see Bond, have to like overtly flirt with a man to, get some information or whatnot? Do you have any kind of feelings or indeed hopes actually about like where the series would go in that regard?
My hope is that he still remains predominantly a heterosexual, bisexual character, but I mean, everyone's somewhere on the spectrum, the Kinsey scale. But I think that he would have casual encounters with men, and it's almost like you want that scene where, like at the start of The Spy Who Loved Me. He's in the Alpine ski lodge or whatever. It would be a brilliant stroke one time if it could be he's with a man, where the man turns him into their collaborators or whatever in the next scene. But just the fact that that happens, and as we've said earlier, gay, bisexual, straight, whatever are labels, but I want those possibilities with Bond, and I don't want him to kind of almost pin himself down to something in particular. I think realistically, I think probably our best chance are some of the other projects outside of the mainstream film series, and I think things could come in that way. Particularly, I'm quite excited about the video game. If it's anything like the Hitman games, which I only played fairly recently, actually, after that announcement about the Bond game, then you can, and you have to sometimes chat up people of the same sex and, different gender identities and so forth. So I think that's probably one way that it might come in, because in a video game, you have far more agency about what the character is going to be doing. And I also think a possibility is, I don't know if Kim Sherwood's going to include she's got 3 00s in her novels, the first one of which is out in September. And I don't know if one of those will be queer. I mean, it stands to reason that MI6, the real MI6 nowadays, has come a very long way in the last couple of decades. And they are said to be one of the more queer inclusive employers. So I think reflecting the real MI6, I think that's probably one of our best bets, really. I don't know, what would you want?
I think we're on exactly the same page here, actually, and I think you're bang on about the potential for these things. It might be more in the extra media, games, books, that sort of thing, as opposed to in the films themselves. I think it would make sense if Whishaw came back to just continue, even though it'll be a new Bond and a new timeline, presumably. It would make sense to just continue on with his character the way he is. I think we might get at some point, I don't think we'll ever have, people talk about Bond girls, I don't think we'll ever have a Bond boy, like a final kind of romantic interest, but I could certainly see there being situations where Bond has to flirt with a man to get information out of him or whatnot. But I think it would be, I think that would be more along the lines of what we'd get. I mean, I do hope that we still get some, fun camp queer villains, because I know that is kind of frowned upon because it's seen as not being terribly progressive, that, evil character is gay or perhaps just not completely straight. But the fact that we got Silva in 2012, that's still fairly recent. So who knows? Maybe we will.
The one that's been staring us in the face, I think, and this has come up a few times actually, is the having Mr. Moneypenny, because it's always sort of a chaste experience. Well, I think that Bond and Moneypenny have sex in Skyfall, but I know not everyone agrees with me. And I think that sort of relationship between Bond and a man would be really interesting. You could accuse the filmmakers of baiting the queer audience if you wanted to, but Bond's been baiting Moneypenny for decades now, so it's sort of traditional, and for me, I think that would work really well.
I very much agree. Okay, well, that about brings us to the end of this discussion. So, David, thank you so much for joining me for this, because it's been great to hear your expertise about these subjects and these characters.
I think we found at least a dozen characters.
Yeah,
didn't we?
That's a lot. And as I said earlier on, like, when you look at some of the longest running, the biggest franchises in cinema, I don't think you could have that same. I know you're really big into Star Wars, much more so than I am. And I know there's an awful lot of extra sort of media around that, films, comics, and whatnot. But certainly in the main series, I can't imagine there being that much sort of to read into, or maybe I'm completely wrong.
Oh God, don't start that, Calvin.
It's a different video.
I've still got 8 Bond movies to go. Well, 9 if you count Never Say Never Again. So I've still got quite a long way to go.
So David, where can people find your work?
So license2queer.com is the main kind of hub for everything, really. That's where I put everything, including, and a lot of people actually don't even know this is on there, but if you look in the top left, cocktail recipes, so there's about 50 of those. We haven't even got on to cocktails, Calvin. I know we've talked about that in the past. So yeah, there's the website, which has been going, it'll be 2 years in April. And then the podcast version, which you can find wherever you get podcasts, and there's a podcast link on the website as well. So you can find that wherever you get podcasts normally. And then the social media feeds, which on Twitter and Instagram, not TikTok. I'm not down with the kids like the official James Bond account has recently been doing. Not yet, anyway. I don't think I have time for TikTok as well. And I am on YouTube, but I don't really do, because I know you that's kind of your main platform. I only use YouTube to kind of store the videos that then get linked to on the website, really. But there's a few bits and pieces on there as well.
Great stuff. Okay, well, thank you very much again for joining me. I really appreciate you hopping on. This really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Calvin. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, take care.
We have Mr. Bleeker.